Len, thank you, Todd, for having me this morning. So I'm speaking today on the subject of campaign finance reform and campaign money corruption. And I'm speaking as a conservative, a liberty Republican. There are different flavors of Republicans, as you all know right now, from quite broad across the spectrum. And I'm going to start out by asking a question. Is there anyone here listening who does not favor what American Promise is working on? We're seeking to basically reverse a 2010 Supreme Court decision called Citizens United. We want to reverse it to restore to Congress and to the states the power to set reasonable limits on campaign spending and contributions, and to allow Congress to set law distinguishing between artificial entities like corporations and unions and individual persons with respect to campaign money. So again, we want to amend the Constitution, reverse Citizens United, restore to Congress powers to set limits on campaign money. Is there anyone listening here who differs with the need for any such amendment like this? Not a person. I don't hear anyone. So here's what's odd about all this. The national polling shows that almost 70% of Republican voters back this amendment. This is 68, 69% is our last poll we at American Promise have done. Almost 90% of Democrats favor this amendment. So you have supermajorities of the public across the political spectrum back this amendment. Here's the rub. In Congress, this is our U.S. Senate and our House, almost, and I think it's every single Democrat co-sponsored the legislation to initiate the process of amending the Constitution. Every Democrat signed on last session. One Republican in Congress signed on to this amendment. Bills before the House and Senate. So we have this incredible gap between public opinion, including people who are Republicans and Republicans in office. So my objective here today with you Rotarians is to challenge you to become proselytizers on this and find people who are Republican members in Congress who you might know, or people who know them, and second order relationships, and move opinions, because as many of you may know, there are two ways to amend the U.S. Constitution. It's been amended 27 times. Each of those amendments has been, in the end, drafted and written by Congress and then sent back to the states for ratification. It takes 3/5 of the members of Congress to get it out of Congress, and it takes 3/4 of the states then to ratify an amendment. The second way to amend has never been used before. It's a state-led 34 states would need to agree on a subject matter, which would lead to an amending convention. Now that convention would then draft language, and that language would be sent back to the states. So we're advocating in AmericanPromise.org the congressional route, the route that the prior 27 amendments. So we have this gap. We have this gap between conservative Republican opinion and Republicans in Congress. So I'm recruiting you to persuade, again, members of Congress and people who know members of Congress who are Republicans. So when I speak as a conservative, I'm looking for arguments that persuade me to back this amendment, and that we have found are moving Republican minds in Congress. And the first one is, before the year 2018, Republicans in the post-Citizens United world had been better at using and getting big money. This is money from concentrated sources, either from billionaires and millionaires who target large amounts of money, to super PACs and C3s and C4s, a variety of instruments where there are really no limits on the amount that can be spent. So Republicans did very well at this until 2018, when it became about even. The 2018 cycle, D's and R's were about even on the extent to which the two parties could raise, expend big money. Now, 2020, the trend continued. Democrats outraised Republicans 2.2 to 1, 220 bucks to every $100. This is all money raised. President Biden outraised Trump 6-1 in dark money. Dark money is political money where you don't know where it came from, which is another problem. President Biden won the election in 2020. He took counties, he won in counties that represent 71% of the GDP of the United States. Donald Trump took and won counties that represent 29% of the GDP of the United States. So what we're seeing, and this is issue number one for Republicans, where we thought, and we being a Republican, where we thought we were winning the big money game, you know, concentrated big money and crushing competitors with more and more ads. We're losing at the game now. We were tied in 2018. We're behind now in 2020. So argument number one for Republicans in office, this is not working for our party anymore. I'm talking too loud, I'm getting too much reverb. That's argument number one. And the impact of this concentrated money, you go to an opensecrets.org website, those of you who have not used it, opensecrets.org, you can track the money. Very, very interesting data there. You can do all kinds of searches. What we're seeing now is that a very small number of people, we're talking in swing district elections, a small number of people who can amass and control large sums of money, people numbering in the several dozens and less, can flow tens of millions of dollars to target races. So we're seeing the federalization, we're seeing the loss of federalism, we're seeing the nationalization of almost every swing district election for US Senate, every swing race there, congressional races, and you're seeing even state house control elections where it's controlled, where it's close. You're seeing national money coming in, large pocketed donors, small number of people determining which candidates are viable, which issues are important in the states, which candidates rise up in this money primary system to viability. And it's hurting the concept embodied in the 10th Amendment to the US Constitution of federalism, where states can do things in a different way based upon their own needs. Federalism has given us the ability to be laboratories of democracy. After all, we are the United States of America. And what may work in New Hampshire with respect to campaign money or agricultural regulations or street signs or lighting or energy efficiency may not be the right solution for Maine or Wyoming. So we have federalism to allow our states to live together in peace. There are certain issues which divide Americans. We're a fractured nation right now, and we don't agree on some fundamental things. And if you have states able to legislate on matters where power is not granted by the Constitution to the federal government, states can do things in a different way, and it helps us live in peace with one another better. The fact that large donors from out of state are swooping into states and controlling election outcomes with large sums of money is damaging federalism. It's nationalizing elections, and it's hurting these laboratories of democracy. It's making us harder to have peace with one another, and it's suppressing the primacy of local voter preferences on which issue approaches are better. And this bothers the heck. I can tell you this bothers the heck out of Republicans, perhaps more so than Democrats, I'm not certain, but it clearly, when we talk to members of Congress and members of state legislatures in various states, when they see people like Mike Bloomberg, who swooped into New Hampshire in 2018, spent large sums of money, and flipped from R to D, our state house, our state senate, and our executive council in the single year in 2018, when Mike Bloomberg, who doesn't live in New Hampshire, has that kind of power, it really disturbs Republicans. Now, of course, it flipped back this year in New Hampshire, so this big money does not always win, but it wins most of the time. Incumbents nearly always win. So I call this out-of-state kingmakers, I call the blue state campaign money aristocracy. I use that term in order to help people who are not conservatives or not Republicans understand what it feels like in a state like Wyoming or a conservative in New Hampshire, to have Mike Bloomberg come into our state and shift the kind of candidates we have and the kind of issues that are important. Another issue that's important to conservatives and Republicans on this big money system. It has caused a shift in free market capitalism to what we call crony capitalism. It is, there are studies now, you can go to, one of the most recent that I like is Sunlight Foundation did a study. They found that for every dollar that large companies spend on lobbying and campaign contributions, they can get in return $760 in things like tax breaks, federal procurement grants, regulatory favors. The payoff of crony capitalism, where you can spend money not on fighting it out in the marketplace by incrementally improving a product or service, but to hire lobbyists and spend money electing your favorite candidate, when it's so much more profitable to go to Washington to meddle in the economy. We see various effects. We see things like oligopolies growing. We see monopolization of the economy increasing. We see new business formations dropping. We see that. We see R&D shifting away from blue sky R&D to near-term stuff, and it has suppressed free market capitalism. It has suppressed choice by consumers, and it has turned young people under 35 years old, now favor some form of socialism over free market capitalism. This really disturbs conservative Republicans when free market capitalism, which, and again, I'm speaking for myself here, it's the engine of more wealth creation, more improvement in quality of life worldwide, not just in America, since we were founded as a nation 240-ish years ago. Free market capitalism has done things like doubling human lifespan. So this shift from free market capitalism to crony capitalism, where big dollars buy politicians, buy policy in Washington, is shifting young people's views and preference towards something that we hold dear. And there are more arguments here, but I'll stop with this one. This crony capitalism has also led to incredible industry consolidation in weapons procurement. We look at our defense budget and we see basically we have only one real de facto vendor for military aircraft now. They control 80% of the market. There are basically 5 companies that control most of weapons procurement. And again, these companies are crony capitalists. They go to Washington to get their procurement contracts elongated. We have weapon systems like the F-35, $1.4 trillion to be spent on that over its lifespan. Well known, well understood to be a rank failure. It does not enhance U.S. national security. Crony capitalism is degrading U.S. national security. The worst thing of all, these weapons procurement contractors get involved in politics in many ways. They fund think tanks. They're involved deeply in opinion shaping, of course, the usual stuff of lobbying and buying politicians with their big money. They have perpetuated, in my view, this string of endless failed wars. 300,000 American fighting men and women have been killed or injured, seriously injured, in these endless failed wars. I believe this can be linked, this failed national security policy can be linked to this campaign money system we have right now, this big money campaign money system. And you'll recall that Donald Trump got elected in 2016 in part because he campaigned. He failed to do this, but he campaigned on ending endless failed war. This is still an issue, and this bothers particularly grassroots conservatives. So these are some of the reasons that conservatives and Republicans at the grassroots level, the voter level, want to see Citizens United reversed, want to see campaign money systems, want to see a restoration of control over our campaign system to local voters, to all voters. These are some of the reasons. Now I'll speak when you talk to conservatives and Republicans, the first pushback you're going to get is the First Amendment defense, because the Citizens United decision, and I'm going to read you some text from that decision. This is a 2010 Supreme Court decision. I'm scrolling down to the bottom of this. The U.S. Supreme Court over 100 years has found money limits to be constitutional on 2 grounds until Citizens United. I'm going to read one sentence from that decision. This court, this is the Citizens United Court, 2010, this court now concludes that independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption. The appearance of influence or access will not cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy. Now, we have seen since that time, since that 2010 decision, the public is overwhelmingly, the 2 opinion polls in the last 2 years have found, this is pre-pandemic, have found the #1 problem, challenge, crisis Americans think faces us is corruption in our political system, political corruption. 2 different polls, high quality polls, bigger than poverty, bigger than war, bigger than income inequality, bigger than medical care, healthcare costs, political corruption. The Supreme Court drew from thin air a factual finding as a predicate to allowing unlimited money through things like super PACs. As a predicate, they found that these things that did happen, American loss of faith in our system of government, they found without basis factually. So when you talk to conservatives, say, well, the First Amendment gives Mike Bloomberg the right to spend, $1 billion to come into New Hampshire and change our political system, should he wish. And conservatives will defend that on First Amendment ground. Well, the problem is that the Supreme Court, over 100 years of jurisprudence, has found that there are balancing tests with respect to the First Amendment. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater, and you can't spend political money to the extent where people lose faith in our democracy. That's what's happened. So this is my rebuttal to conservatives who say the First Amendment gives people the right to spend unlimited sums of money to buy politicians, even out-of-state politicians. My rebuttal is this big money system we have right now, this concentrated big money system, has corroded confidence by the American public in our form of government so seriously that it forms a basis, a constitutional basis to restore these limits. Now, the Supreme Court is not going to reverse itself, not the way it is now. So this is why we need the 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which, very brief, we have a sample language in AmericanPromise.org. And again, it would allow Congress, doesn't say how, and the states to restore reasonable limits on campaign spending and contributions. And should Congress wish to distinguish between artificial entities like corporations and unions and individual, the living people, with respect to those contributions. So it doesn't say what Congress or the states can do, it simply restores their power. So a place like Wyoming, which in the late 1800s banned corporate contributions, they did so because Anaconda owned their legislature. The people of Wyoming amended their constitution to ban Anaconda from owning their legislature. Our Supreme Court in 2010 eliminated Wyoming's right to do that. We'd like to restore Wyoming's right to do that. So there's a bit of my arguments. We urge you to check out AmericanPromise.org and to join us in any way you like, and to work to find conservatives, find Republicans who need persuading on this. You can use some of those arguments I spoke about there. And you can perhaps even know someone who knows a member of Congress. We need more members of Congress to sign on to these bills, which would allow this amendment to happen. Thank you, and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Jim. Questions? David Allen, you're on mute. There you go.
Yeah, I find your argument very persuasive, Jim, but I have to confess I'm suffering a bit of cognitive dissonance, because it seems that as I think of my conservative Republican friends and where they're thinking it right now, I hear them saying that the election was stolen, that people have lost faith in the elective system because people who aren't eligible to vote are voting, and that the reason we have crony capitalism is because we have a crony electoral process, and people who are voting shouldn't be voting. And so their focus seems to be on denying the right to vote to poor people, minorities, making it more difficult to vote, no voting by mail, those types of measures. And that seems to be on the other side of the issues that you're saying we should use to convince people to throw out Citizens United. So it's cognitive dissonance is what I'm experiencing.
Yeah, well, if you ask folks concerned about, election systems, right to vote issues, go back before the 2020 election, all of the problems I described existed. This is before there was, a very large increase in the extent to which it became easy to vote in 2020. Okay. All of the problems that I talked about existed at the loss of faith in our form of government, the crony capitalism. So yes, states are going to wrestle with these issues, and states are going to wrestle with them in different ways. In Hanover, I know here, we have college students voting. The New Hampshire legislature shifts back and forth from D to R, the extent to which people should be able to vote. And I'm going to defend not a lot of it, because the Republican strategy to reduce access to voting, I believe, is basically raising the white flag and our ability to communicate our views on how conservatism can solve the nation's problems. Saying that people should not vote because they're going to vote against our ideology, that's loss of confidence in our own ability as a conservative and as a Republican to advocate and persuade on how to build back faith in things like free market capitalism. I believe it's the wrong approach. But I would not try to engage in that argument, because it's a tough one, and just ask folks to reflect on the elections before 2020. All of these problems were there. When you had companies going to Washington, when you had Mike Bloomberg coming in and flipping our legislature in 2018, all of the problems pre-existed. But I'll agree with, as a Republican, I don't agree with the approach of suppressing voter turnout in order to win elections. That shows extreme lack of confidence in what we stand for.
I saw Tom's hand up.
Hi, Jim. Hey, what kind of support do you find among Democrats for the proposal? And if there isn't support, can you explain it for us, maybe?
For the 28th Amendment?
Yeah.
Yeah, almost universal. In Congress, if you look at the bills in the House and Senate last year, I think every single D became a co-sponsor of the 28th Amendment. Every single one. So, and among the public, almost 90% of Democrats voters support this. But again, almost 70% of Republican voters back it.
Yeah.
Wayne.
How does this amendment relate to HR 1, the For the People Act?
This amendment is not in HR 1. HR 1 has a bunch of stuff in it, but not the 28th Amendment. It's a different legislative process. There are separate bills for this. At American Promise, we're working because this issue has become so extremely partisan in Congress. We're working to find Republican lead sponsors of the amendment. The Republicans who draft the amendment, they would float it, and it would come out with equal numbers of Ds and Rs as launch co-sponsors. But we're working, and we have people in Congress we're talking with that are favorable to us. They're not public yet, so we already have 22 state legislatures, including New Hampshire's last year, has asked Congress to do this. Some of the states that have 22 states have passed resolutions, legislative resolutions, asking Congress to do this. New Hampshire did this last year.
So do you think now that the legislature's flipped in New Hampshire that it will still support it?
Probably not. I would say I've testified for the New Hampshire legislature this year on some simpler campaign money limits. If you folks might know this, under New Hampshire law, there's a loophole. So if you have an LLC, LLCs can give money to other LLCs, and so you can have 10 LLCs under the same individual controller give money to a candidate to skirt the total limit. A bill to end the LLC loophole in New Hampshire went down in flames on a very partisan basis in New Hampshire. So these are when you get up to legislatures, it gets campaign money control gets really partisan. And it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be.
Any other questions? Kevin, go ahead.
I'm sorry if I missed it in the first few minutes, but is there a specific proposal in the 28th Amendment on how to end the big money in politics? Like, what would it say?
Well, if you go to congress.org, you can see the language of amendments that are being sponsored, that have been sponsored. American Promise, we have suggested language on our website, but the general consensus is it ought to do first, restore to Congress and the states the power to set reasonable limits on campaign contributions and expenditures. That's simple. A variant of the amendment, which American Promise backs, would restore to Congress the power with respect to campaign money to distinguish between corporations, unions, and actual living people. Those are the key elements of the 28th Amendment think ought to be in it. Language varies, but the language is pretty simple, pretty short. Congress does the heavy lifting on defining exactly what the limits might be, the timelines, all of the details are deferred back to Congress. In fact, the 20th Amendment doesn't even compel Congress to set those limits. It simply restores Congress's and the state's power to do that. So it's a simple. Amendments to pass requires enormous public support. So keeping it simple, easy to understand, that's the approach to get the U.S. Constitution passed. We have the hardest Constitution to amend in the free world. So we've got to be very, very cognizant of the need. When the language gets through Congress and goes back to the states, it's got to be very easy to explain, very understandable, and supported completely across the political spectrum. Otherwise, it won't pass.
John Hackreiter.
Jim, how are you?
Very well.
To think that you're spitting into the wind here a little bit. But that aside, I applaud the idea. I think the concept is fantastic, but I'd like to get your thoughts on this that Trump has set up his own PAC, and he is suggesting that people contribute to his PAC and not the RNC or the Senate or House, committees for Republican.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, he's just another Michael Bloomberg now. He's another New Yorker transplanted to Florida who can amass large sums of money from small donors, but it's under his control. The fact that there are millions of donors to his, whatever it might be, a super PAC of some kind, he is controlling which candidates are viable in any state where there's a swing election. And so the question, let's say you love Donald Trump, just hypothetically, do you want him selecting candidates in your state, a state he might not live in? If you don't live in Florida, do you want him picking the candidates that can survive a primary, picking the issues that candidate will campaign on? It's a horrible thing for federalism. So if you're truly a conservative who believes in the right of states and the voters in states to shape their own destinies in all areas not prescribed by the Constitution and not reserved under the 10th Amendment to the federal Congress, you would despise that Mike Bloomberg and Donald Trump would be able to come into your state and shape your elections. So that's a tough argument for folks who love Donald Trump, but it's a practical reality that you're extinguishing states' rights. You're extinguishing the primacy of local, real, on-the-ground voters in your state. Got to wrestle with that. So spitting into the wind, no, because when I talk and when we talk with individual Republicans in office, both at the state and federal levels, these arguments that I've proffered here resonate. But the poisonous partisanship on many issues has made this a Democratic issue. So that's why we're working very hard, find Republicans willing to stand up and become the lead champions. They're not going to sign on to a bill with every Democrat already signed on to. That's not going to happen. We've got to get it so Republicans are leading on this issue, and they buy the arguments. We know this privately, and we know this will work. It's a big lift.
Any other questions?
One last one.
Go ahead, Tom.
So Jim, I agree with you that it's unlikely that the Supreme Court would reverse itself, but I'm curious because the new appointees to the court basically are Federalist Society types. And what's the Federalist Society's viewpoint on this? You would think they would be fully supportive of what you're saying.
Yes. Well, we heard the term cognitive dissonance earlier in the Q&A period. So yes, at this court, recall the text I read you from the Citizens United decision, when the court, without any factual analysis whatsoever, determined that unleashing unlimited forms of money would not corrode public confidence in democracy. So we are not, none of us are entirely consistent in our political philosophies.
Well, Jim, I think we'll end it there. Thank you very much. I think that was a great presentation, great questions, and good luck.
May I just urge you all to go visit AmericanPromise.org. Check us out, join us.